The courtroom was tense, the air thick with anticipation as Judge Monica Hayes entered, her black robes flowing behind her. The sharp echo of her heels on the polished wooden floor silenced the murmurs in the room. Monica was a striking figure, her confidence and authority radiating from every movement. Her reputation as one of the toughest, most impartial judges in the state preceded her, and the weight of her presence was felt by all. She was a black woman who had risen through the ranks in a system that often seemed designed to suppress her. Despite the obstacles, she had earned her place at the top with integrity and relentless pursuit of justice. Today, she faced one of the most controversial cases of her career, a case that had the entire city talking. At the center of the trial was Sergeant Kyle Bennett, a white police officer accused of fabricating evidence, coercing false confessions, and using excessive force against Black and Latino suspects. He had been a decorated officer at one point, but his career had been riddled with complaints and internal investigations that mysteriously never went anywhere. Many saw him as the embodiment of everything wrong with the justice system: unchecked power, corruption, and deep-seated prejudice. Yet, Bennett was here not because of his many victims, but because the evidence against him had become impossible to ignore. Even his connections within the police department and local government couldn't shield him any longer. Monica sat behind the elevated bench, her expression unreadable as she scanned the courtroom. To her left, the prosecution team, led by Assistant District Attorney Lisa Carr, was busy arranging files and whispering final points of strategy. Lisa was young but fierce, someone who had built her career on taking on cases others avoided. This was her chance to prove herself on a high-profile stage, and Monica could see the determination in her eyes. On the other side of the courtroom sat Bennett with his defense team. He leaned back in his chair, his body language dripping with arrogance. He wore a smug grin as if the whole trial was a joke to him. To Bennett, this wasn't a fight for his freedom, it was a test of how far his influence could stretch. He had allies in the department, friends in high places, and a belief that his badge made him untouchable. Monica didn't need to guess his thoughts. She had seen his kind too often in her career. Men like Bennett thrived on fear and manipulation, but in her courtroom she was the one in control. The trial began with opening statements. The prosecution laid out a damning case detailing Bennett's history of misconduct. Witnesses had come forward, risking retaliation, to testify about his abuses of power. Video evidence, damning reports from internal affairs, and the chilling testimony of victims painted a picture of a man who had long operated above the law. The tension in the room grew as Lisa Carr spoke, her voice steady and deliberate. "This case is not just about Sergeant Bennett," she said, her eyes locking onto the jury. "It's about a system that allows men like him to act with impunity. Today, we begin to take that system apart." When it was the defense's turn, Bennett's lawyer, an older man with a silver tongue, tried to discredit the evidence and paint Bennett as a misunderstood hero. He spoke of the pressures of policing, the dangers of the job, and the sacrifices officers made to keep the city safe. "My client," he said with practiced sincerity, "has dedicated his life to protecting this community. He's not perfect, but none of us are. This trial is a witch hunt, plain and simple." Bennett smirked as his lawyer spoke, glancing occasionally at Monica as if daring her to intervene. Monica remained calm, her face betraying none of her thoughts. She had heard every excuse before, every attempt to twist the narrative and make victims seem like perpetrators. But she knew the truth, and more importantly, she trusted the jury would see it too. As the trial progressed, the cracks in Bennett's facade began to show. Witness after witness testified about his violent outbursts, his manipulative tactics, and the fear he instilled in those he was supposed to protect. One witness, A young black man named Andre, who had been falsely accused of theft, recounted his harrowing experience with Bennett. His voice trembled as he described being thrown against a wall, handcuffed, and beaten for a crime he didn't commit. The room was silent as he finished, his pain palpable. Bennett, however, showed no remorse, only rolling his eyes as if bored by the proceedings. Despite the mounting evidence, Monica could feel the undercurrents of resistance. Bennett's connections were working behind the scenes, trying to influence the outcome. She had received anonymous threats warning her to tread carefully, subtle reminders that her position wasn't as secure as it seemed. But Monica wasn't one to back down. She had built her career on defying expectations, on standing firm in the face of adversity. This case was no different. The turning point came when Bennett himself took the stand. His lawyer had advised against it, but Bennett's ego wouldn't allow him to stay silent. He believed he could charm the jury, manipulate them into seeing him as the victim. But under cross-examination, Lisa Carr exposed his lies. She brought out evidence of text messages where he bragged about planting evidence and reports from his colleagues detailing his violent tendencies. Bennett's composure faltered as Lisa pressed him, his answers growing more defensive and contradictory. Monica watched closely, her sharp mind piecing together the bigger picture. She could see the fear creeping into Bennett's eyes, the realization that his usual tactics wouldn't save him this time. But even as his case unraveled, Bennett's arrogance didn't waver. He glared at Monica, his hatred for her evident. To him, she wasn't just a judge, she was a threat to everything he stood for. The morning session ended, and Monica announced a short recess. As she rose from her chair, Bennett stood as well, his movements deliberate. He walked toward the judge's bench, ignoring the murmurs around him. The court officers hesitated, unsure whether to intervene. Bennett's lawyer called out to him, but he didn't stop. Monica turned, her expression calm but alert. She could see the rage simmering beneath Bennett's facade. He approached her, his fists clenched, his breathing heavy. "You think you're better than me," he hissed, his voice low but venomous. "You think you can take me down? You're nothing. You're just another." Before he could finish, Bennett raised his hand and struck her across the face. The courtroom gasped, the sound of the slap echoing like a gunshot. Time seemed to freeze as Monica stood there, her head turned slightly from the force of the blow. The court officers finally sprang into action, but Monica raised a hand to stop them. Slowly, deliberately, she turned back to face Bennett. Her eyes burned with an intensity that made him take an involuntary step back. Monica's voice was steady, unshaken, as she spoke. "You just made the biggest mistake of your life." The room fell silent, a palpable shock rippling through everyone present as Judge Monica Hayes remained motionless for a moment, the sting of Sergeant Kyle Bennett's slap still fresh on her face. Bennett stood frozen in place, his chest heaving from adrenaline, his hand still slightly raised as if he couldn't believe what he'd just done. The courtroom's usual decorum had shattered in an instant, and what replaced it was a suffocating tension, thick and heavy. Monica slowly turned her head back toward him, her piercing gaze locking onto his. Her expression wasn't one of fear or even anger, it was something colder, sharper, and infinitely more unsettling. Bennett, despite his bravado, took a small, instinctive step back. Her eyes held a ferocity that seemed to strip away the layers of arrogance he wore so proudly. The court officers, finally breaking out of their stupor, moved toward Bennett, their hands reaching for him. But Monica raised her hand, stopping them in their tracks. Her voice, calm and steady, cut through the tense air. "Do not touch him." Pah. The officers hesitated, confused by her command. The prosecution team and the defense attorneys stared in stunned silence, unsure of what would happen next. No one dared to move. Monica, still holding Bennett's gaze, slowly stepped down from the bench, her robe flowing behind her like a shadow. The only sound in the room was the faint echo of her heels as she approached him. "You just assaulted a sitting judge in open court," she said, her tone measured but laced with a chilling authority. "Do you have any idea what that means?" Bennett's lip curled into a sneer, though the bravado was faltering. "What it means," he spat, "is that you've overstepped your place. You think you can humiliate me in front of everyone and walk away unscathed? You're nothing but a—" Before he could finish, Monica closed the distance between them. Her movements were deliberate, controlled, and precise. With a swift, calculated motion, she grabbed his wrist and twisted it behind his back, forcing him to bend forward with a sharp cry of pain. The courtroom gasped collectively as Bennett's towering figure was brought low by a woman half his size. Monica's grip was unyielding, her military training evident in the ease with which she subdued him. "I suggest," she said quietly, her voice carrying throughout the room, "that you choose your next words very carefully. You are no longer a sergeant in this moment. You are a man in handcuffs waiting to be processed for felony assault." Bennett struggled against her hold, his face contorted in rage and humiliation, but she tightened her grip, sending another sharp jolt of pain through his arm. He let out a strangled grunt, realizing he was completely at her mercy. Monica's calm demeanor only made the scene more terrifying for him. This wasn't a woman who could be intimidated or broken, this was a force of nature. The courtroom officers, emboldened by her dominance, finally moved in. Monica released Bennett with a firm shove, and he stumbled into their waiting hands. As they cuffed him, he twisted his neck to glare at her, his fury now mingled with a hint of fear. "You think this ends here?" he growled. "You're making a mistake, Judge. I have friends in high places. You won't walk away from this unscathed." Monica stepped back, her robe settling around her as she adjusted the neckline with quiet precision. She didn't flinch at his threat, nor did she acknowledge the murmurs spreading through the courtroom like wildfire. Instead, she spoke directly to the court officers. "Escort him to holding, and notify the district attorney that we have additional charges to process." As Bennett was dragged out of the room, the energy in the courtroom shifted. The defense team sat stunned, their carefully rehearsed strategies and planned arguments now utterly irrelevant. The prosecution looked to Lisa Carr, who was still frozen in disbelief. The young Ada finally regained her composure, standing up and straightening her blazer. Her voice was steady as she said, "Your Honor, I believe a recess is in order." Monica nodded once. "Granted. We will reconvene in 1 hour with that." She turned on her heel and strode out of the room, her steps confident and unwavering. The courtroom exploded into chaos behind her, voices overlapping as lawyers, reporters, and spectators tried to process what they had just witnessed. Back in her chambers, Monica closed the door and leaned against it for a moment, exhaling slowly. Her hand instinctively went to her cheek, where the faint sting of Bennett's slap lingered. She stared at her reflection in the small mirror hanging on the wall, her face calm but her mind racing. She knew this wasn't over, not by a long shot. Men like Bennett didn't act out of impulse, their actions were calculated, deliberate. The slap wasn't just an attack on her dignity, it was a message. There was a knock at the door. Monica straightened, smoothing her robe before calling out, "Come in." Lisa Carr entered, her face a mixture of concern and admiration. "Your Honor," she began cautiously, "are you all right?" Monica gave a small, reassuring nod. "I'm fine, Ms. Carr. Thank you." Lisa hesitated, then stepped closer. "What just happened out there? It's going to be all over the news within the hour. This case was already high profile, but now she trailed off, unsure how to phrase her next thought. Monica crossed her arms, her expression thoughtful. Now it's not just about Bennett. It's about everyone who enabled him. This isn't just one man's trial anymore, it's a reckoning for the entire system that allowed him to thrive. Lisa nodded, the gravity of Monica's words sinking in. Do you think they'll try to retaliate? Monica met her gaze, her eyes steady. They already have. That slap wasn't about me. It was about sending a message to anyone who dares to hold men like Bennett accountable. But they've underestimated me. Lisa felt a surge of resolve at Monica's unwavering determination. What do you need from me, Your Honor? Monica's lips curved into a faint smile. Stay focused. Present the evidence, and let the truth do the rest. Bennett's unraveling, and the more desperate he becomes, the more he'll expose himself and his allies. Lisa nodded firmly. I won't let you down. As Lisa left, Monica returned to her desk, her mind already strategizing the next steps. She knew the trial would only become more dangerous from here on out. Bennett's connections were likely already working to spin the narrative, to discredit her, and to protect their own interests. But Monica wasn't afraid. She had faced worse in her life, and she had no intention of backing down now. This wasn't just about justice for Bennett's victims, it was about dismantling the entire corrupt system he represented. And if they wanted a fight, Monica was ready to give them one. The hour-long recess felt like an eternity for those waiting in the courtroom. The charged atmosphere refused to dissipate, and the absence of Judge Monica Hayes only heightened the tension. Conversations buzzed among the attendees, speculation running wild. The audacity of what had just transpired, a police sergeant striking a sitting judge in full view of the court, was beyond anything most had ever witnessed. For some, it was an undeniable confirmation of the broken system that Bennett represented. For others, it was a dangerous escalation that could lead to unpredictable consequences. Meanwhile, in the courthouse's holding cells, Bennett paced like a caged animal, his cuffs jangling against his wrists. His earlier bravado was still present, though cracks were starting to form in his carefully constructed facade. The walls of his influence seemed to close in on him, and for the first time in years, he felt genuinely vulnerable. Two officers stood by the cell door, their expressions neutral, but Bennett could sense the unease in their postures. They weren't his usual allies, the ones who would wink and nudge, assuring him that they had his back. These men didn't seem eager to offer any support, and it made him itch with frustration. Do you know who I am? Bennett growled, his voice echoing off the cold concrete walls. You think you can keep me in here? I've got more friends than you can count. One call, and this whole charade is over. One of the officers exchanged a glance with his partner but said nothing. Their silence infuriated Bennett further. He slammed his palm against the metal bars, his face contorting in rage. Answer me. You think you're any different from the rest? You're nothing without people like me keeping this city from falling apart. From down the hall, the faint click of heels interrupted his tirade. The sound grew louder, closer, until the unmistakable figure of Judge Monica Hayes appeared at the entrance to the holding area. She wasn't flanked by security or clerks, she had come alone, her presence commanding the space as if it were her courtroom. Her robe had been replaced with a fitted blazer and slacks, and her expression was cold, unreadable. The officers immediately stiffened, their professional demeanor snapping into place. Your Honor, one of them said, nodding in deference. Monica ignored the pleasantries and fixed her eyes on Bennett. Open the cell, she ordered, her voice calm but unyielding. The officers hesitated for a split second, glancing at each other. Your Honor, one began cautiously. Are you sure that's... I said. Open the cell, she repeated, her tone brooking no argument. Reluctantly, the officer complied, unlocking the door and stepping aside. Bennett straightened, a grin spreading across his face. He assumed this was his moment of vindication, that the judge had come to apologize or offer some kind of deal to save face. He flexed his wrists, as if already imagining the cuffs coming off. Well, he sneered as she stepped inside, the cell door clanging shut behind her. Finally came to your senses, huh? I knew you'd see reason. Monica didn't respond immediately. She stood a few feet from him, her hands clasped in front of her, her eyes piercing through him like steel. The silence stretched uncomfortably long, and Bennett's grin faltered. He opened his mouth to speak again, but she cut him off. You've spent your entire career hiding behind that badge, she said, her voice low but firm, using it as a shield, as a weapon, as an excuse for your behavior. But in this room, in this moment, you're just another man who doesn't understand the meaning of consequences. Bennett's expression darkened, his grin twisting into a scowl. Don't you lecture me about consequences. You think sitting behind that bench makes you untouchable. You're just another cog in the machine, Judge. You're not better than me. Monica took a step closer, her movements deliberate and measured. You think I'm afraid of you, she asked, her voice unwavering. You think your threats, your posturing, your connections make you powerful. All I see is a man who's terrified of losing the only thing that gives him the illusion of control. Bennett's hands clenched into fists, his body tense with barely restrained anger. You don't know a damn thing about me. I know enough, she said coolly. I know you've spent years abusing your authority, terrorizing the people you swore to protect, and silencing anyone who dared to stand in your way. I know you've operated with impunity because the system has allowed it. But that ends now. Bennett took a menacing step forward, closing the gap between them. You think you can take me down, he snarled. You think you're some kind of savior? You're nothing, Hayes. You hear me? Nothing. In an instant, Monica moved. Before Bennett could react, she grabbed his wrist and twisted it in a precise, controlled motion, forcing him to his knees. The suddenness of her action left him stunned, his cry of pain echoing in the small cell. The officers outside stepped forward, alarmed, but Monica raised a hand to stop them. Stay where you are, she commanded without looking back. Bennett struggled against her grip, his breath ragged as he tried to regain control. You think this makes you strong, he spat, his voice filled with venom. This is assault. You're no better than me. Monica leaned in, her voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. The difference between you and me, Sergeant, is that I don't need to hide behind lies or fear to hold my ground. You've built your power on intimidation and corruption, and now it's crumbling beneath you. I'm just here to make sure it falls. She released him abruptly, and Bennett collapsed to the floor, clutching his wrist. He glared up at her, his face a mask of hatred and humiliation. You're making a mistake, he growled. You don't know who you're messing with. Monica straightened, brushing invisible dust from her blazer. Oh, I know exactly who I'm dealing with, she said, and I'm not impressed. She turned to leave, her heels clicking against the concrete floor as she walked away. The officers quickly stepped back into position, their eyes darting between Bennett and the judge. Monica paused at the cell door, glancing over her shoulder one last time. You should get comfortable, she said. You're going to be here for a while. As she exited the holding area, Monica felt the weight of the moment pressing against her. She knew she had just escalated the situation, but it wasn't out of recklessness or anger. It was a calculated move, one designed to strip Bennett of the power he clung to so desperately. He thrived on fear and control, and she had taken both away from him in a single, decisive act. Back in the courtroom, the buzz of speculation continued. Reporters had already caught wind of the altercation, and whispers of Bennett's behavior were spreading like wildfire. The defense team was in disarray, scrambling to figure out how to salvage their case. Lisa Carr, on the other hand, was laser-focused, her mind racing with ways to use the incident to their advantage. When Monica re-entered the courtroom, the room fell silent once more. All eyes were on her as she ascended the bench, her composure as unshakable as ever. She adjusted her papers and cleared her throat. "This court is now back in session," she announced, her voice steady and authoritative. "Before we proceed, I want to make one thing clear: this trial is about accountability. It is about justice, and it will not be derailed by the actions of those who seek to undermine it. We will continue, and we will see this through to the end." The room remained silent for a moment, the weight of her words sinking in. Then, slowly, the proceedings resumed. But beneath the surface, the tension lingered, a reminder that the battle was far from over. For Monica, this was no longer just a trial, it was a fight for the very soul of the system she had dedicated her life to defending. And she was ready for whatever came next. The courtroom was cloaked in an uneasy stillness as the trial resumed. Judge Monica Hayes sat at the bench, her expression calm and composed, though the faint shadow of the earlier confrontation still lingered in the air. The spectators were silent, their eyes flicking between the judge, the defense table, and the prosecution. The tension that had gripped the room since Sergeant Kyle Bennett's brazen act had only intensified. Now the case felt like more than just a trial, it was a reckoning, and every person present could feel the weight of what was unfolding. Lisa Carr, the young assistant district attorney, rose from her seat and adjusted her papers. She glanced briefly at Monica, whose steady gaze gave her a small but vital boost of confidence. This was her moment to push the case forward, to ensure that Bennett's crimes wouldn't be buried under procedural delays or legal maneuvering. The evidence was damning, but Lisa knew Bennett's defense team would use every trick in the book to undermine it. "Your Honor," Lisa began, her voice firm but respectful. "The prosecution would like to call its next witness." Monica gave a single nod. "Proceed." The doors at the back of the courtroom opened, and a man in his mid-30s walked in, his posture rigid, his eyes scanning the room nervously. He was dressed neatly, but there was an unmistakable tension in his movements, as though every step toward the witness stand was a battle with his instincts to turn and run. His name was Andre Coleman, a former victim of Bennett's abuse of power. Andre had been arrested 3 years earlier for a crime he hadn't committed, his confession coerced under threat of violence. Today he was here to tell his story. As Andre was sworn in and took his seat, Monica studied him closely. His hands trembled slightly as he adjusted the microphone, his eyes darting nervously toward Bennett, who sat at the defense table with his characteristic smirk. Bennett's casual demeanor only fueled the unease in the room. It was clear that his arrogance hadn't diminished in the slightest, despite his earlier humiliation. "Mr. Coleman," Lisa began, her tone gentle but precise, "can you please describe your interaction with Sergeant Bennett on the night of your arrest?" Andre hesitated, his eyes briefly flicking toward Monica, who offered him a reassuring nod. Taking a deep breath, he began to speak. His voice was low and shaky at first, but as he recounted the events of that night, a steely determination began to surface. "I was walking home from work," he said. "It was late, maybe around 11. I'd just finished a double shift and stopped by the corner store to grab a snack. That's when he pulled up." Andre's eyes narrowed slightly as he glanced at Bennett, who leaned back in his chair, arms crossed, exuding an air of indifference. "He got out of his car and told me to stop. Said I looked suspicious. I tried to explain I was just heading home. but he wasn't listening. He asked for my ID, and when I handed it over, he told me to put my hands on the car. Lisa stepped closer to the witness stand. And did you comply with his orders? Andre nodded. Yeah, I didn't want any trouble. I put my hands on the car, and that's when he started searching me. I told him I didn't have anything, but he kept going, calling me names, saying I fit the description of someone who robbed a liquor store. Lisa's voice remained steady, though the underlying anger was evident. And did Sergeant Bennett find anything during his search? No, Andre said, his voice gaining strength. Because I didn't do anything. But that didn't matter to him. He kept saying I was lying, that I'd stashed something nearby. Then he cuffed me and shoved me into the back of his car. Monica's expression didn't waver, but inside she felt a familiar pang of frustration. This wasn't the first time she had heard a story like Andre's, but it didn't make it any less infuriating. She noticed Bennett whispering something to his lawyer, the smirk on his face widening, as though he found the testimony amusing. Lisa continued. What happened after you were taken into custody? Andre's jaw tightened. He took me to the station and put me in an interrogation room. I kept telling him I didn't do anything, but he wasn't hearing it. He said if I didn't confess, things were going to get rough. He slammed his hand on the table, got right up in my face. I was scared. I didn't know what to do. Lisa paused, allowing his words to sink in before asking her next question. Did you confess? Andre hesitated, shame flickering across his face. Yeah, he said quietly. I confessed to something I didn't do. I just wanted it to stop. I thought if I said what he wanted to hear, he'd let me go. The courtroom was silent, the weight of Andre's words pressing down on everyone present. Lisa turned to the jury, letting the testimony hang in the air before addressing them directly. This is the man sitting before you, she said, gesturing toward Bennett. A man who used his badge to terrorize an innocent citizen into confessing to a crime he didn't commit. This is not an isolated incident. It's a pattern of abuse, manipulation, and a blatant disregard for the law. Bennett's lawyer stood abruptly. Objection, Your Honor. The prosecution is making inflammatory statements. Monica raised a hand, silencing him with a single look. Overruled. Continue, Ms. Carr. Lisa nodded, her confidence growing. Mr. Coleman, after your confession, what happened next? They charged me, Andre said bitterly. I spent 6 months in jail before the charges were dropped. 6 months of my life gone because of him. Lisa let his words linger for a moment before stepping back. No further questions, Your Honor. The defense attorney wasted no time leaping to his feet. He approached the witness stand with an air of feigned politeness, his tone dripping with condescension. Mr. Coleman, you say you were coerced into confessing, but isn't it true that you have a prior record? Lisa immediately objected. Your Honor, Mr. Coleman's record is irrelevant to this case. Monica's voice was firm, sustained. Counsel, move on. The defense attorney's jaw tightened, but he quickly pivoted. You claim Sergeant Bennett threatened you. Do you have any proof of these alleged threats? Any recordings? Witnesses? Andre stared at him, his frustration evident. No, it was just me and him in that room, but I know what he did. And so does he. The attorney smirked, shaking his head as if to dismiss the testimony entirely. No further questions, Your Honor. As Andre stepped down, the tension in the courtroom remained palpable. The prosecution's case was strong, but it was clear the defense would stop at nothing to undermine the credibility of the witnesses. Monica watched Bennett carefully, noting the slight twitch in his jaw as Andre walked past him. The sergeant's smirk had faltered, if only for a moment. As the next witness was called, Monica's mind raced. She could feel the undercurrents of something larger at play, a web of influence and corruption that extended far beyond Bennett himself. This trial wasn't just about one man, it was about an entire system that had allowed him to operate with impunity for so long. And that system wasn't going to go down without a fight. The day dragged on, witness after witness taking the stand, each testimony painting a clearer picture of Bennett's abuse of power. But as the trial wore on, Monica noticed something troubling. Members of the jury began to shift uncomfortably, their expressions growing wary. It was subtle, but it was there a sense of fear, as though the weight of what they were being asked to do was becoming too much to bear. Monica's suspicions were confirmed during a recess when one of the jurors approached her clerk, visibly shaken. The clerk relayed the message to Monica in private. The juror had received an anonymous threat, warning them to make the right decision or face consequences. Monica's jaw tightened as she processed the information. Bennett's allies were clearly trying to intimidate the jury, a move that reeked of desperation but also posed a serious threat to the integrity of the trial. She immediately called a meeting in her chambers with Lisa Carr and the defense attorney. "This trial is under attack," she said bluntly. "We need to address this before it spirals out of control." The defense attorney feigned ignorance. "Your Honor, I have no knowledge of any such threats. My client denies any involvement." Lisa wasn't buying it. "Of course he denies it. That doesn't mean he isn't behind it." Monica held up a hand, silencing them both. "Enough. I don't care who's responsible. What I care about is ensuring this trial continues without interference. I will not let anyone undermine this court's authority." The tension in the room was thick as Monica issued her orders. Extra security measures would be put in place, and any further attempts to intimidate the jury would be met with swift and severe consequences. As the meeting adjourned, Monica sat alone in her chambers for a moment, the gravity of the situation pressing down on her. She knew the stakes had just been raised. This trial wasn't just a battle for justice, it was a war against a deeply entrenched system of corruption. And Monica was determined to see it through, no matter the cost. The courtroom was tense as the trial moved into its next phase, the air electric with the weight of what had already unfolded. The threats to jurors had heightened the stakes, pushing the proceedings into dangerous territory. Judge Monica Hayes sat at the bench, her expression unreadable but her posture firm. She understood all too well the risks of continuing. This trial wasn't just a test of Bennett's guilt or innocence, it had become a crucible for exposing the larger rot within the system. But with every new revelation, it became clearer that forces beyond the courtroom walls were working to destabilize it. As the next witness was called, Monica glanced at the jury. Despite the added security measures, unease lingered in their expressions. Some of them avoided her gaze entirely. This was what Bennett's allies wanted to make them doubt the safety of doing the right thing. Monica knew that if the jury crumbled under the pressure, the entire case would collapse. But she also knew that fear could be fought with resolve, and she intended to demonstrate that resolve at every turn. The doors at the back of the courtroom opened, and a middle-aged man with a serious, weathered face walked in. He was tall, with a presence that suggested years of experience in high-stakes environments. This was Captain Marcus Vance, a former police officer who had worked with Bennett years ago. Vance was an unexpected witness, a late addition to the prosecution's case after he'd come forward with information about Bennett's activities. His testimony, if credible, could cement the prosecution's case. Lisa Carr, the ADA, looked at Vance as if he were the cavalry. She had fought hard to get him to testify, knowing full well the risk he was taking by speaking out against one of his own. Vance had already faced threats and intimidation since agreeing to testify, but his sense of duty had driven him to this moment. As Vance took the stand and was sworn in, the room seemed to hold its collective breath. Bennett, seated at the defense table, glared at Vance with a mix of anger and contempt. Monica noticed Bennett whispering to his lawyer, his expression darkening with each passing second. Lisa wasted no time. "Captain Vance, can you describe your relationship with Sergeant Bennett during your time on the force?" Vance nodded, his voice steady and deliberate. "I worked with Bennett for about 5 years. At first he was just another officer, but as time went on it became clear he operated differently." Lisa tilted her head. "Can you elaborate on what you mean by differently?" Vance's jaw tightened. He had a reputation for being aggressive, for pushing boundaries. It started small, bending the rules during arrests, cutting corners on paperwork. But over time it escalated. He began fabricating evidence, coercing confessions, and using excessive force, particularly against minority suspects. A murmur rippled through the courtroom, but Monica quickly silenced it with a sharp rap of her gavel. "Order," she said firmly. Lisa pressed on. "Did you report any of this behavior to your superiors?" Vance hesitated, a flicker of guilt crossing his face. "I tried, multiple times, but every complaint I filed either disappeared or was dismissed. Bennett had connections, friends in high places who made sure nothing stuck." Lisa's voice sharpened. "So you're saying there was a deliberate effort to protect him?" "Yes," Vance replied. "Bennett wasn't just a rogue officer. He was part of a system that rewarded loyalty over integrity. The people who should have held him accountable were the same people who enabled him." Bennett's lawyer stood abruptly. "Objection, Your Honor. Speculation." Monica didn't hesitate. "Overruled. Captain Vance is providing testimony based on his personal experience." The lawyer sat down, his frustration evident. Bennett leaned toward him, whispering furiously, but Monica's focus remained on Vance. Lisa continued. "Captain Vance, you've mentioned that Bennett used excessive force. Can you provide a specific example?" Vance took a deep breath, his expression somber. "There was an incident about 4 years ago. A young man named Jamal Carter was arrested on suspicion of burglary. He was just a kid, barely 18. Bennett was the arresting officer. When Jamal insisted he was innocent, Bennett took him into an interrogation room alone. When Jamal came out, his face was swollen and he could barely walk. Bennett claimed Jamal had resisted, but it was clear to anyone who saw him that he'd been beaten." Lisa's voice softened, though the underlying anger was clear. "And what happened to Jamal Carter?" "He confessed to the crime," Vance said bitterly. "Even though the evidence against him was flimsy at best. He spent 2 years in prison before the conviction was overturned." Lisa let the silence stretch for a moment before addressing the jury. "This is the man sitting before you," she said, gesturing to Bennett. "A man who abused his authority to destroy lives, and this is the system that allowed him to do it, time and time again." The defense attorney rose, his expression tight. "No further questions for this witness, Your Honor." As Vance stepped down, Monica watched him carefully. He had delivered a damning testimony, but she could see the toll it had taken on him. He left the courtroom quickly, his shoulders tense, as if bracing for the fallout. The next moments unfolded with terrifying speed. Just as Lisa prepared to call her next witness, a commotion erupted near the courtroom entrance. The doors burst open, and a man in a dark suit rushed in, his face pale and his movements frantic. He whispered something to the court officers, who immediately approached the bench. Monica leaned forward, her expression sharp. "What's going on?" she demanded. One of the officers whispered urgently in her ear. Monica's face hardened, her jaw tightening as she processed the information. Turning to the courtroom, she addressed the attendees. "We are taking an immediate recess. Everyone is to remain inside until further notice." The room buzzed with confusion, but the gravity in Monica's tone silenced any protests. As she left the bench, she glanced at Lisa, who followed her into chambers, her expression full of questions. Once the door closed behind them, Monica spoke quickly. "There's been an incident. Captain Vance was attacked outside the courthouse." Lisa's eyes widened in shock. "What is he?" "He's alive," Monica interrupted, though her tone was grim. "But he's been taken to the hospital. Witness intimidation has now escalated to outright violence." Lisa's face flushed with anger. "This has gone too far, Your Honor. We can't let them get away with this." "We won't," Monica said firmly. "But we need to act carefully. If they're willing to attack a former captain in broad daylight, there's no telling what they'll do next." Lisa nodded, her determination renewed. "What do you need me to do?" Monica's mind raced as she considered their options. "Get the next witness ready. We're going to continue this trial no matter what. But we also need to increase security for everyone involved: witnesses, jurors, even the prosecution team. They're trying to scare us into submission, and we can't let them succeed." As the recess ended and Monica returned to the bench, the tension in the courtroom was palpable. Word of the attack had spread, and the atmosphere was thick with fear and uncertainty. Bennett, however, looked unbothered, even amused. His smirk was back, his confidence seemingly restored. Monica's eyes locked onto him, her gaze cold and unyielding. "Let's proceed," she said, her voice cutting through the tension like a blade. "The defense may call their next witness." The trial continued, but the stakes had never been higher. Monica knew that the attack on Vance was just the beginning. The forces working against them were becoming more desperate, more dangerous. But she also knew that desperation was a sign of weakness. And she intended to exploit that weakness to its fullest extent. The courtroom was silent, the weight of the trial pressing down on everyone as the end loomed near. Judge Monica Hayes sat at the bench, her steady gaze moving between the defense table and the jury box. The events of the past days had shaken even the most stoic among them: anonymous threats to the jurors, the brutal attack on Captain Vance, and the pervasive shadow of corruption that loomed over the proceedings. Yet Monica had held firm, refusing to allow fear to dictate the course of justice. Today, she knew, everything would come to a head. Sergeant Kyle Bennett sat with his defense team, his once smug demeanor now strained. Though he still tried to project confidence, the cracks were beginning to show. His lawyer whispered something to him, but Bennett barely reacted. He glanced toward the jury, his jaw tightening as he noticed their weary but resolute expressions. Whatever influence his allies had tried to wield behind the scenes, it was clear the jury wasn't entirely cowed. The testimony of Captain Vance, despite the attack meant to silence him, had shifted the narrative in a way Bennett couldn't control. And Bennett, a man accustomed to control, was visibly unraveling. Lisa Carr stood to deliver the prosecution's closing arguments. She adjusted her blazer and approached the jury, her voice firm and deliberate. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, over the past days you've heard testimony from victims, witnesses, and even fellow officers who've bravely come forward to speak the truth. You've seen evidence that paints a clear and disturbing picture of a man who believed himself above the law. But this trial is not just about Sergeant Bennett. It's about the system that allowed him to thrive. It's a system that must now be held accountable." Lisa walked slowly along the jury box, meeting each juror's eyes as she spoke. Bennett used his badge not as a symbol of service but as a weapon of fear. He planted evidence, coerced confessions. and terrorized innocent people, many of whom looked just like me or you. He believed that his connections and his uniform made him untouchable. But justice does not wear a uniform. Justice does not recognize fear or power. Justice recognizes the truth, and today the truth is clear. She paused, letting her words sink in before continuing. The defense will tell you this is about doubt. That maybe, just maybe, the evidence isn't enough. But let me remind you, doubt is not a shield for the guilty. It is your duty to see through the smoke and mirrors, to hold this man accountable for what he's done, not just to his victims but to the very fabric of our community. I ask you to deliver the justice that so many have been denied. Lisa returned to her seat, her head held high. Monica allowed the room a moment to absorb the impact of her words before turning to the defense. Counsel, you may proceed. Bennett's lawyer rose, his expression tight as he approached the jury. He was a seasoned litigator, and despite the overwhelming evidence against his client, he exuded a practiced confidence. Ladies and gentlemen. He began, we've heard a lot of emotional testimony in this trial, stories designed to provoke anger, outrage, and sympathy. But emotion is not evidence. My client is a dedicated officer who served this city for years. Yes, he made mistakes, who among us hasn't? But mistakes are not crimes. The lawyer gestured toward Bennett, who sat stiffly at the table. Sergeant Bennett is not a perfect man, but he is not the monster the prosecution has painted him to be. The burden of proof lies with them, and I submit to you that they have failed to meet it. Do not let passion cloud your judgment. Look at the facts, and you will see that doubt remains. And in our system, doubt means one thing: not guilty. He returned to his seat, his argument succinct but hollow. Monica turned to the jury, her voice steady as she said, "The jury will now retire to deliberate. Court is adjourned until a verdict has been reached." As the jury filed out, the tension in the room remained thick. Bennett leaned back in his chair, his arms crossed, but the slight tremor in his hand betrayed his nerves. Monica watched him carefully, noting the way his eyes darted toward the doors, as if calculating an escape route. He was a man cornered, and she knew from experience that cornered men were the most dangerous. Hours passed. The courtroom emptied as people left for the evening, but Monica remained in her chambers, her mind racing. She thought about Captain Vance, still recovering in the hospital, and Andre Coleman, who had risked everything to testify. She thought about the jurors, who carried the weight of the city's expectations on their shoulders. And she thought about Bennett, whose smirk and arrogance had finally given way to desperation. This trial wasn't just about him, it was about dismantling the structure that had enabled him. The verdict would be a turning point, one way or another. Late that evening, the clerk knocked on her door. "Your Honor, the jury has reached a verdict." Monica straightened, smoothing her robe before stepping into the courtroom. The room had refilled quickly, the air thick with anticipation. The jury entered, their faces solemn, and took their seats. Monica addressed the foreperson. "Has the jury reached a verdict?" The foreperson, a middle-aged woman with a determined expression, stood and held a slip of paper in her hand. "We have, Your Honor." Monica gestured for the paper to be handed to her. She read it silently, her face impassive, before returning her gaze to the jury. "Will the defendant please rise?" Bennett stood, his face a mask of controlled rage. He refused to meet Monica's eyes, his focus instead on the jury, as though he could will them into submission with his glare. Monica's voice was steady, authoritative. "On the count of felony assault, how do you find?" The foreperson's voice was clear. "Guilty." A murmur swept through the courtroom, quickly silenced by Monica's gavel. She continued, "On the count of evidence tampering, how do you find?" Guilty. T. The tension in the room snapped like a taut wire, the weight of the verdict crashing down on Bennett. His jaw tightened, his hands balling into fists at his sides. Monica could see the storm brewing behind his eyes, the realization that his invincibility had been shattered. The foreperson continued to read the verdicts guilty on all charges. Monica allowed the finality of it to settle over the room before addressing Bennett directly. Sergeant Kyle Bennett, you have been found guilty on multiple counts, including felony assault, evidence tampering, and abuse of power. This court will reconvene for sentencing. Until then, you are remanded into custody. Bennett's composure cracked as the court officers approached to take him into custody. He lashed out, shoving one of them and shouting, "This isn't over. You hear me? You think you've won, but you don't know who you're messing with. I'll bury all of you." Monica remained calm, her voice cutting through the chaos like a knife. "Sergeant Bennett, your threats only serve to underscore the justice of this verdict. Remove him." As Bennett was dragged from the courtroom, his shouts echoed in the hallways, but Monica's focus was already on the next steps. This trial was a victory, but it was only the beginning. The corruption that had protected Bennett for so long still lingered, its roots deep and tangled. But for the first time in years, the system had taken a step toward accountability. Monica adjourned the court and returned to her chambers, where she allowed herself a brief moment of reflection. She knew the road ahead would be difficult. There would be retaliation, backlash, and attempts to undermine her. But she also knew that this moment mattered. This verdict wasn't just about punishing one man, it was about sending a message that no one was above the law. As she sat at her desk, a sense of quiet determination settled over her. The fight was far from over, but Monica Hayes had never been one to back down. The courtroom had emptied, but the echoes of the trial still lingered in the air like a storm that had passed but left destruction in its wake. Judge Monica Hayes sat in her chambers, her hands resting on the wooden desk, the weight of what had transpired pressing against her chest. Kyle Bennett had been found guilty, his carefully constructed world shattered in front of him, but Monica knew this was far from the end. Justice had been served for now, but justice was never a single moment. It was a war, fought battle by battle, and Bennett's conviction was just one victory in a war that was far from over. A knock on her door pulled her from her thoughts. Lisa Carr stepped inside, her face a mixture of exhaustion and triumph. She set a thick folder on Monica's desk. "It's done," she said, exhaling sharply. "Bennett's being processed as we speak." He tried to get a last-minute appeal in, but the judge handling it denied him. "He's going to prison." Monica leaned back in her chair, studying Lisa for a long moment before nodding. "Good," she said, "but you know it won't end here." Lisa ran a hand through her hair, sighing. "Yeah, I know. But this was huge. We didn't just take down one bad cop, we made it clear that no one, not even someone like him, is untouchable." Monica gave her a small, knowing smile. "Lisa, I need you to understand something," she said, her voice softer now. "Bennett was a symptom, not the disease. And when you cut out a symptom, the disease doesn't just go away. It finds another way to spread." Lisa's expression darkened, and she sat down across from Monica. "You think they're going to come after you?" she asked. Monica exhaled slowly. "They already have. The threats to the jury, the attack on Vance, Bennett's allies trying to sway this case, it's all part of a larger machine that's been operating for years. And that machine doesn't just stop running because one cog was removed." Lisa nodded grimly. "So what now?" Monica glanced at the folder Lisa had set down, flipping it open. Inside were files, documents, reports, pieces of evidence that hinted at a network far larger than just Bennett. Monica had suspected this from the beginning, but now, with Bennett behind bars, she had proof that he wasn't acting alone. There were others, officers and officials, who had protected him, who had helped him plant evidence, falsify reports and silence those who spoke out. "We keep going," Monica said, her voice firm. "This case might be over, but the fight isn't." Lisa smirked slightly. "You always this relentless." Monica chuckled, shaking her head. "Comes with the job. And with knowing that the minute we let up, they'll try to take everything back." Another knock came at the door. This time it was one of the courthouse security officers, his expression unreadable. "Your Honor, there's someone here to see you. He says it's urgent." Monica arched an eyebrow but nodded. "Send him in." The officer stepped aside, and an older black man in a tailored suit walked in, his presence commanding but calm. He carried himself with the quiet confidence of someone who had seen the worst the world had to offer but had refused to be broken by it. Lisa stood, recognizing him instantly. U.S. Attorney Gerald Morris, she said, almost in disbelief. Monica straightened, intrigued. "Mr. Morris, what brings you to my chambers?" Morris took a seat, his sharp eyes scanning Monica before he spoke. "Judge Hayes, let me start by saying what you did in that courtroom? It took guts. Most people would have folded under that kind of pressure." Monica tilted her head slightly. "I don't scare easily." Morris smirked. "I know. That's why I'm here." He leaned forward, placing a thick folder of his own on the desk. Bennett wasn't just a dirty cop. He was a key player in something much bigger, something that extends far beyond this city. Corruption, extortion, trafficking, you name it, and he had a hand in it. But he wasn't the mastermind. He was just one of many. Monica glanced at the folder but didn't open it. "And you want my help?" "I want your leadership," Morris corrected. "The Justice Department is launching a federal probe into this network, but we need local allies. People who aren't afraid to make enemies. People like you." Lisa let out a low whistle. "You're talking about taking down an entire system." Morris nodded. "That's exactly what I'm talking about." Monica sat in silence for a moment, her mind racing. Accepting would mean putting an even larger target on her back. It would mean risking everything she'd built, not just her career, but her life. But then she thought of Andre Coleman, of Jamal Carter, of Captain Vance lying in a hospital bed because he had dared to speak the truth. She thought of the countless names she didn't know, the victims whose stories never made it to a courtroom. She reached forward and pulled the folder toward her, flipping it open. Inside were names, photographs, timelines of events that painted a damning picture of a system that had thrived in the shadows for decades. Finally, she closed the folder and looked up at Morris. "When do we start?" Morris smiled. "We already have." Monica exchanged a glance with Lisa, who grinned. "Looks like we're in for another fight." Monica exhaled, a slow, deliberate breath, then stood. "Good. Because I'm just getting started." As the three of them shook hands, Monica felt it an unshakable certainty that this moment was bigger than just her. This wasn't just about taking down a corrupt cop or even a broken system. This was about building something better in its place. The war wasn't over. But for the first time in a long time, it felt like justice had a fighting chance.